For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Rehove. Professor Jane Duncan from the University of Johannesburg's Journalism Department joins me to discuss her latest book, The Rise of the Securocrats, The Case of South Africa. Your book explains the case of South Africa being accused of having fallen under the sway of a shadowy group of Securocrats. Please explain what Securocrats are and what effect this is having on the country's leadership, policy and other aspects.
Well, Securocrats are managers of the security cluster, and in this case I'm talking about the police, the intelligence and the military. And generally in a democracy, including in South Africa, the security cluster and the leadership of the security cluster are kept under very tight control because of the high potential for abuse of the security cluster in order to crack down on political opponents of the ruling party. So I think it's extremely dangerous for a democracy where the Securocrats within the security cluster start to become a lot more powerful than in fact they should be. And it's my concern that we've been seeing this trend taking place in South Africa. And just some indicators of it. We've seen, for instance, the introduction of the Protection of State Information Bill or the Secrecy Bill that has been greatly improved, but in its earlier iterations it showed an intention on the part of the security cluster and the Securocrats within it to draw a cloak of secrecy over many aspects of society that actually don't need secrecy. We've seen, for instance, justifications of spending on the security upgrades of President Jacob Zuma's residence in Nkandla on entirely spurious grounds. We've seen the growth of the intelligence services, I think, beyond what we need in a country that doesn't really face significant threats to national security. And we've also seen a case being made by the police for more resources in order to adopt a more paramilitary style of policing. And we've seen in the military, for instance, arguments being made for very high-tech weaponry, whereas in reality the boots on the ground need far more basic resources. And this leads to a situation where we saw in the DRC, for instance, where the military was starved of the basic necessities that they needed in order to, successfully carry out that particular mission. So it's these kinds of warped priorities that a country can experience if the Securocrats start to dominate decision-making in government.
You state that your experience of writing this book taught you just how serious the problem of secrecy is in South Africa's security cluster. Why do you say this?
Well, I really struggled to get information in order to write this book, and I think I struggled unjustifiably. Again, in a democracy there should be reasonable levels of transparency when it comes to the operation of the security cluster, and unfortunately I think we've erred on the side of excessive secrecy. Many intelligence services, for instance, argue that secrecy is necessary in order to maintain operational secrets. But I think we've gone too far in the direction of secrecy, and many aspects of policy, for instance, or even including operational policy that should be in the public domain around what the intelligence services are doing, are not publicly available. And I confronted this problem head on when I was writing this particular book. The way that I got around it was that I relied particularly on the accounts of political activists, because what I'm trying to do in this book is to look at the impact of the growth and influence of the security cluster on democratic spaces, and particularly spaces for political activism in South Africa. And I interviewed a lot of political activists, putting together an account of how they have experienced the police, intelligence and the military in the conduct of their everyday activism. And that certainly allowed me to build up a very rich picture of what's taking place in the country, notwithstanding the secrecy problems I encountered.
How worried should we be about developments in the security cluster?
I think we should be extremely worried. I don't think we're going back to the kind of situation that we had in under apartheid, where the National Security Council really dominated key decisions that were taken by the apartheid state. We still have a situation where the security cluster remains under democratic control, primarily through Parliament and through the constitutional constraints on its powers. But I think that there's certainly a more authoritarian drift that we're seeing in society, and we're seeing increasing abuses of the powers and functions of the security cluster in order to limit the space for political activism. I go into this issue in a great amount of detail in terms of how it's impacted, particularly on the right to protest. I don't think we should rest on our laurels and say that because we've got a good constitution, we can take it for granted that we're not going to lapse into further authoritarianism. I think what we are starting to see is the growth of informal repression, where increasingly whistleblowers and political activists in various parts of the country are being assassinated for speaking out about cases of corruption and mismanagement of public resources. So this is the danger that we face in a constitutional state, because there is still democratic control over the armed might of the state. This may give rise to the informalization of repression, and I fear that that is a trend that we're seeing at the moment that is intensifying.
How would you evaluate the state of journalism on the activities of the security cluster?
I'd say the state of journalism is very mixed. I think when it comes to holding the leaders in the security cluster to account, I think it's done a very good job. So, for instance, the media, did an excellent job in exposing the spending excesses on the Nkandla upgrades. The media exposed a lot of the shenanigans that were going on inside crime intelligence at the time that Richard Ndluli was there, and there've been a host of other stories, I think, that have been very important in keeping the political leaders in the security cluster in check. But I think when it comes to telling the story of the growing abuses of the powers of the security cluster at the base of society, amongst the working class and the unemployed and political activists who represent those constituencies, I think we're doing fairly badly. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that we don't have the kind of journalism that we need in order to check the growth in police violence against workers and against protesters, for instance. We don't have the analytical depth and the forensic skills that are necessary in order to be able to do this area of journalism justice. Our journalism is paper thin when it comes to reporting on police violence, and nowhere was this more evident than in the early press reporting of the Marikana massacre. We've got a lot of work to do in terms of bringing up our journalism to meet that fundamental challenge that we've got in society.
A society of secrets is a society where those in positions of power will most likely abuse that power, which is why the powerful often fear transparency so much. Can you provide examples of this in South Africa?
Well, I think one example would be the initial excessive secrecy around the reporting on the Nkandla security upgrades. But I think with a lot of advocacy journalism that took place, I think that the boundaries of secrecy around that particular issue were challenged. But nevertheless, I think that there's still excessively high levels of secrecy that we and journalists included, I think just accept, and we need to push the boundaries of those more vigorously. So, for instance, I don't think that reporting on security-related issues has remained a serious beat in South African journalism, and because of that, we don't see journalists working consistently on those kinds of issues. And if we did, for instance, we'd have journalists who would challenge the excessive secrecy around South Africa's national intelligence priorities, for instance. Now, in a democratic setup, the threats to national security, as they understood by the intelligence services, should be a matter of public debate. There should be a national consensus. In fact, there should even be a parliamentary debate about what the country considers to be the major threats to national security. That doesn't necessarily have to involve going into operational methods or other operational aspects, because we're dealing with issues on a level of generality that would allow operational secrets still to remain secret. But I think, unfortunately, the intelligence services have conflated operational methods with operational policy and argue that all of it should be secret. So as a result, we've got no way really of assessing what government is saying the major threats to national security are versus what they actually are in reality. So, for instance, when I attempted to conduct an analysis of what government considers to be the major threats to national security, I found that there was no mention, for instance, of the political assassinations, whereas there was an extraordinary level of attention being paid to the protests, for instance. Which I think is problematic, because if you adopt a more securitized approach towards protests, you can inevitably focus on crushing those protests rather than dealing with the underlying causes of those protests. It's these kinds of debates that we need in our country, and if we don't have these debates, it can lead to significant intelligence failures. And we've seen in the US, for instance, how significant intelligence failures have arisen, particularly because of the excessively high levels of secrecy in the intelligence services. And there's no better, or should I say worse, example than that, than 9/11.
You suggest that South Africa's apparent securitization needs to be understood as part of a global trend towards big brotherhood, which has been precipitated in part by world events such as the September 11 attacks and the global financial crisis. Please elaborate.
Well, I think with 9/11, we saw a massive focus on increasing national security, initially in the US and then subsequently in the Five Eyes countries and then even further afield. And we've seen many countries seizing on national security as an excuse in order to do a whole load of things that ordinarily they wouldn't do, even if they don't face major threats to national security, particularly terrorist threats. And South Africa there is a case in point. So, for instance, the US has implemented mass surveillance of communications, and we've come to know about the extent of this particular practice through the Edward Snowden revelations. But South Africa too also practices mass surveillance. We know that the mass surveillance capacities of the state have been used in the past in order to keep political critics of the ruling party under surveillance. I mean, that has been revealed. But we don't know how the mass surveillance capacities of the state are being used now because of the extremely high levels of secrecy around it. But that notwithstanding, we know that the government has mass surveillance capacity. We know that there are South African companies that are manufacturing mass surveillance technology, because it's been found in the listening rooms of the autocrats in North Africa, notably in Libya. And we know that the South African government has also been funding the development of mass surveillance technology as well. Now, it's only a matter of time before mass surveillance is declared unlawful in some court in some country somewhere because of its excessive intrusion into the right of privacy. And there's no indication of any major terrorist threat to national security ever having been picked up and preempted through mass surveillance. So there's no substantial case for mass surveillance, and yet different countries, including South Africa, continue to practice it. That is an example of how a country like South Africa has seized on the 9/11 drive towards national security and used it in order to, I think, engage in very problematic practices, including suppression of political dissent.
The Protection of State Information Bill, or the Secrecy Bill, would be the latest addition to existing policies and practices that undermine democracy. What are some of these existing policies and practices?
Well, apart from the Secrecy Bill, we have the National Key Points Act that is effectively making it impossible to report or even understand what's going on in relation to national key points and strategic installations. And this is problematic in a democracy because there's no justification for excessively high levels of secrecy in relation to those areas. So, for instance, there is some evidence that's come into the public domain that the security measures in relation to South Africa's nuclear capacity hasn't been as good as it should be. There was a theft at some stage in the past, or an attempted theft of material that could be used in order to manufacture nuclear bombs. This was at Pelindaba. We can't have a sensible inquiry into whether material like that has been secured sufficiently if we have such excessively high levels of secrecy. So it's these kinds of problems that we've got. We have a security cluster that's completely obsessed with secrecy. I've tried, for instance, to get information about how the surveillance capacities of the state are being used, the communication surveillance capacities. So, for instance, I've asked questions about the number of arrests and convictions that have resulted from the interception directions that are issued in terms of RICA. Haven't been able to get the information. We should be demanding information about the number of joint deployments of the police and the military, because the military shouldn't be deployed as a matter of principle in domestic policing functions, particularly when it comes to public order policing, and yet we're seeing this increasing trend. We don't know enough about the paramilitarization of the South African police and the uses to which these extremely highly weaponed paramilitary units, such as the Special Task Force, the National Intervention Unit, the uses to which they're being put. It's those kinds of things that we need to know in order to hold the security cluster to account. We don't know these things. We've been lulled into a belief that we shouldn't have access to this information on grounds of national security, and because of that I think we've also been architects of our own problem when it comes to the lack of accountability of the security cluster. I think we've been lazy when it comes to pushing the boundaries around what information we rightfully should have access to.
How can South Africa resist a growing culture of secrecy and authoritarianism?
Activism. Be an activist around these issues. I'm involved, for instance, in an organisation called the Right to Know campaign, that I think has done, even if I say so myself, important work around holding the Securocrats to account, and also making sure that the secrecy bill is made slightly more acceptable than it was previously. I think political activists also need to document more a lot of the security abuses that are taking place at the moment. So, for instance, we had recently a press conference that was called by NUMSA, where they alleged that a number of their activists had been spied on and offered money, in fact, to spy on the organisation and the establishment of the new United Front. That we should be extremely worried about, but it's that kind of exposure of these issues that we need more of. So we need a serious documentary effort, and we need journalists working on this as a serious beat, taking it seriously as a systematic beat rather than reporting on it episodically.